Nope. And we are live. Hello, everyone. Can you just confirm, please, in the chat that you can hear me and see me OK? Just wait. I have to wait a few seconds because there's a slight delay between me speaking and you seeing it on the video and responding in the chat. Audio, video, loud and clear. Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. This is the massive open online course in digital currencies for the master's degree by the University of Nicosia. And this is session 2, which is basics of cryptocurrency. Today, we're going to be talking a lot about mining, the Byzantine Generals Problem, and consensus across a distributed network. I hope you're all ready. We've got some great questions from the audience, so we'll start asking them now in order. Eric asks, how much better is the Bitcoin solution to the Byzantine Generals Problem than the old ledger models with external audits? Is this a control shift from one group of people, the old ledgers, to a group of software coders, an improvement, given that all systems are built by corruptible people? Eric, the solution here is not a solution that is better or worse overall. Rather, it is a matter of what you are optimizing. In this case, what we're looking at with the consensus algorithm in Bitcoin and other open blockchains is a solution to the Byzantine Generals Problem that is decentralized. The Byzantine Generals Problem specifically is the problem of coordination of multiple participants who have no central authority. Prior solutions to this involved some form of centralization, or they involved a federated group who took turns authorizing transactions. So is the Byzantine General Problem solution that Bitcoin provides better than previous models? You can't really say it's better, but what it is it's more decentralized, or rather, it's less centralized. What this solution does is it does shift control. It shifts control from perhaps a small group that controls who can put transactions into the ledger, and shifts that to coalitions of miners who get to choose which version of software they run, which can be generated by different software development teams and have different consensus rules. And so in Bitcoin, we're not just decentralizing control over the ledger itself to miners. We're also decentralizing control over the software because the miners who have economic incentives can choose which software to run. The users who use wallets and make transactions can also choose which software to run. All of the participants can choose their software. And that means that the software coders don't have as much power. The power is decentralized. The miners don't have as much power in the system. It spreads power to more participants. Martin asks, how do we identify areas where the Byzantine Generals Problem exists other than money? Will more Byzantine Generals Problems prone areas emerge now that we have solutions? Absolutely. And we've already seen a number of different areas emerge that are related to the Byzantine Generals Problem. In general, this problem is about coordinating different participants across a network without those participants having to trust each other. So anytime you have a distributed application where participants are communicating across a network, they can't trust the network, they can't trust each other, but they need to coordinate on achieving consensus over a common problem. Then you can apply similar solutions to the consensus algorithm that's used in Bitcoin. So it doesn't have to be about money. Other interesting areas, for example, are voting. And so we can see already applications where voting, for example, in elections, or voting to decide on how a corporation should be managed, and international corporations with shareholders, can also be managed through the process and through consensus algorithms similar to Bitcoin's. Jacobus asks, how do other consensus mechanisms like proof of stake solve the Byzantine Generals Problem? Are blockchains without proof of work more or less vulnerable to attack than Bitcoin? Great question, Jacobus. So proof of stake and other consensus models solve the Byzantine Generals Problem in a different way. And they solve it by forcing the participants to put a commitment of funds, which is called the stake, behind a certain selection of chains within the blockchain system. So in Bitcoin, with proof of work, the participants have to commit energy. And when they commit energy, they risk losing that energy. Rather, they risk losing the money they spent on energy if they don't solve the consensus problem according to the rules that everybody in the system is following. In proof of stake, the participants deposit money, and that money is locked for a period of time. And if they select the correct blocks and validate the rules of consensus, then they can get that money back, and they get a small reward. But if they don't follow the consensus rules, then they lose the money that they deposited, their stake. So it's a different way of solving the same problem. Now, the question is, the second part of this question is, are blockchains without proof of work more or less vulnerable to attack than Bitcoin? We don't know that yet. And in fact, proving the strength of a particular consensus algorithm is a very complicated area of computer science. Pardon me. So what we do know is that blockchains that use proof of stake instead of proof of work may be vulnerable to different attacks than those that proof of work consensus algorithms are vulnerable. We don't know if they're more vulnerable or less vulnerable, but more it's a matter of whether they're vulnerable to different types of attacks. So the types of questions you need to ask with consensus algorithms are, who can change the past? Who can change the future? How much effort or money or energy it takes to make a change? And who can tell whether a change has been made, and how quickly can they tell? How can they tell that a change has been made? And proof of work and proof of stake have different characteristics as to how they protect changes in the past, changes in the future, and what the cost is. Changing the past is what we call immutability, whereas being able to decide what transactions go into the future is finality. And different algorithms may have different vulnerabilities across those axes. Let me check in the chat room and see if we have any follow-up questions on these two topics. All right, the next question is probably a difficult one, so I'll try to make it as succinct as possible. Eric asks, could you please describe the steps of proof of work? Let's see if we can do this. All right, Eric. Every miner is connected to the network, and they are constantly receiving a stream of transactions and blocks. When they receive a new block, that means that the previous round of mining has been completed and someone found a proof of work. And so if they were trying to find that block, they quit immediately and start working on the next block. Because if someone's already won, that competition is over. And this happens every 10 minutes on average. So let's say you're a miner and you just heard on the network what someone claims to be a valid block. Now, here's the tricky part. Someone claims this is a valid block, but you don't know if it's a valid block until you have validated it. So, but if you received it, it's very likely that it is a valid block because other miners who forwarded it to you or other nodes who forwarded it to you have probably already validated it. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't, but let's say you've received it. You don't know if it's valid yet, but it probably is. So the first thing you do is you immediately start mining for a new block, which you characterize as a child of this block you just received, which means as a miner, you construct a new candidate block, which is the block you're going to work on. You make the block you just received its parent, and you do that by putting the hash of the block you just received in your new candidate block as the previous block. And then you immediately start mining. And the reason you immediately start mining is because you want to get a head start in this competition. This is a race. So you want to leave the start line as quickly as possible. Now, it's going to take a few milliseconds to validate that block. And during those few milliseconds, perhaps seconds even, you may not be able to find a block. But there is a small chance that you will be extra lucky and you will find a block even while you're validating the previous block that just came in. Now, miners can put transactions into their candidate block, but not at first. And the reason is because the miner doesn't know if the block is valid, and they don't know what transaction it contains and whether those transactions have already been mined. So just to make sure not risk trying to mine an invalid block, they're going to start with a candidate block that is empty. While they're mining, they're going to start validating this previous block that they received off the network to make sure that it's correct. As they validate it, they also receive all of the transactions that that block contains and compare them against the transactions they have. And if they find that one of the transactions that they had waiting for mining has already been included in the previous block, they take it out of the memory pool. They move it out of the unconfirmed because that transaction is now confirmed. And they validate all of the transactions that are in the block they just received. Once they've completely validated all of the transactions that are in that block, now they know what transactions are not confirmed and what transactions just got confirmed. So now they actually have a pool of transactions ready to put in the candidate block. They start going through the mempool, and they pick transactions with the highest rate of fee per byte so that they can get the maximum profit for the block. And as they add transactions to the candidate block, they replace what they're mining with this new candidate block that has transactions in it, until eventually they fill that block and they start mining a full block. So effectively, during this race, the moment you receive a block, you start mining an empty block. Then as you validate the block and remove transactions from the mempool that have already been confirmed, you can now add transactions to this block. When you fill that, you can now mine a full block. And what you're doing when you're mining is you're taking all of the transactions in your candidate block, you're adding them all up using the Merkle tree structure, you're creating a header for the block, and then you hash the value of that header repeatedly. And you produce a hash for the block. And you're trying to see if the hash for that block has a number of leading zeros which correspond to the difficulty. And you keep hashing and hashing and hashing. Now, keep in mind, the miner isn't doing this manually, of course. All of this is done automatically by software. And the mining equipment that's doing the really fast hashing has a difficulty target, so it knows how many leading zeros to receive. To look for, and it has a block header that it's mining, and it just continually hashes that, changing the nonce in order to find a proof of work. The moment a proof of work is found that justifies the difficulty target, then that candidate block is immediately broadcast to everyone as a valid solution. So those are the steps of proof of work in summary. Eric has a follow-up question. How are mining fees established? Are they random values attributed by the one who made the transaction, or are they predetermined by some consensus? Eric, it depends on the blockchain, but in the case of most blockchains, mining fees are established through competition in a marketplace. And the way that works is your wallet, when it constructs a transaction, has to decide how much of a transaction fee to include. And it will look at what unconfirmed transactions are currently in the mempool, meaning look at who else is competing for space. And from that, it will calculate the average amount of satoshis per byte, so fee per byte, that other people are willing to pay to get their transaction in, and calculate approximately how many transactions are going to fit in the next block, and set the transaction fee accordingly. Now, most wallets nowadays allow you to set the transaction fee based on a target of how soon you want to get your transaction included. So do you want to get it included in 1 to 3 blocks, or 3 to 6 blocks, or 6+ blocks, for example? And you might call that high priority, medium priority, low priority. Now, based on the priority, your wallet is going to try to estimate what fee it would take to entice a miner to put your transaction in the very next block they're mining. So you're bidding. It's almost an auction. You don't know what other people are going to bid after you bid. You only know what people have already bid for the existing space. So you can say, OK, all of the transactions out there currently have 2 Satoshi per byte fee. So maybe if I also put 2 Satoshi, or maybe I put 3 Satoshi byte fee, then my transaction has a good chance of getting in immediately. That doesn't mean that the moment you make the transaction, somebody else can make 1,000 transactions with 20 Satoshi per byte fee, and suddenly your fee isn't enough to get in. That's one of the difficulties with fee calculation. Now, think about it from the other perspective. The miner sees all of these incoming transactions and can basically use an algorithm to sort through them and sort them by the order of the highest paying Satoshi per byte fee transactions, the highest priority transactions. So when the miner then constructs a candidate block, they simply start taking from the top of that list transactions and putting them into the candidate block until they run out of space. That's basically the algorithm. It's a very simple algorithm. And the way you get into that first block is by paying enough Satoshi per byte. Transactions that the miner has seen are sorted by their fee per. Yours is the top order. Let's go back to the chat room and see how people are doing with these answers. And a quick check with Andreas if you can still hear video and audio well. Very good. We had some problems in the last few seconds. And it's back. Very good. David asks, in a mining pool, are the miners coordinating their efforts to solve the block puzzle? In other words, is the Merkle root of the transactions in the block the same for each miner? David, that's a great question. And in fact, that question is really one of the most important questions when it comes to how centralized control over mining pools is. The answer is it depends. And what it depends on is which algorithm is being used, which protocol is being used for communication between the mining pool and the miners. So the way miners organize in a mining pool is they use a specific protocol. And that protocol is the communication between them and the mining pool operator. Now, there are a number of different protocols. Stratum is one you may hear, for example. And these protocols have different ways of operating. So in some cases, the mining pool operator sends out a block template which allows the miners to insert transactions of their choosing, which means that the algorithm for choosing what transactions are going to be mined in the candidate block is on the side of the miners, not the mining pool. In other protocols, that decision is made by the mining pool. In fact, in most cases, it's made by the mining pool operator. So the mining pool chooses transactions to put into the candidate block, sends that candidate block to the miners, and the miners then mine that candidate block. They don't get to choose what transactions get inserted. The difference between these two is the difference between who has power over the selection of transactions in a mining pool. So it's a very, very important difference. So the answer, David, simply is both cases exist today in Bitcoin, and it depends on how the mining pool specifically works. Anastasios asks, when the maximum supply of Bitcoin is reached and the respective blocks are complete, how will the miners be compensated? Will they just get fees? And will that be enough to cover expenses? That is a great question, Anastasios. So the answer is yes, they will just get fees. You got it correctly. And will that be enough to cover expenses? It will be enough to cover expenses for the simple reason that the number of miners participating and the amount of expense they will incur is dynamically adjusted by the difficulty algorithm, so that if some miners find it too expensive to participate, they turn off their mining equipment. It reduces the number of miners, the difficulty decreases, and then it is more profitable for each of the miners to remain who have higher profitability. Miners are not a singular block. In fact, the degree of profitability varies quite substantially between miners. Some miners have extremely cheap sources of electricity. Some miners have very, very low cost of operations. Keep in mind that when you're running one of these big Bitcoin mining farms, we're talking about a massive warehouse with massive amounts of electricity that have to go through electrical panels and massive amounts of equipment, and this equipment fails. And some of it has to be switched off, replaced with new equipment, switched on again, connected to the network. The network can have problems, et cetera, et cetera. All of this requires maintenance and management. And miners are constantly upgrading their equipment. So a big determination of how expensive it is how well they manage operations. How cheap is their electricity? How efficient is their mining equipment and the algorithm they use and the mining pool they collaborate with and the bandwidth they have and the latency of that bandwidth, et cetera, et cetera. All of these factors affect profitability. The bottom line is that fees are intended to replace the mining reward. So the mining reward of new coins, seniorage as it's called, runs out in the year 2140. Now, obviously, that's a very long time away. And the Bitcoin system by then will be very different from what it is today. And it constantly changes. The capacity of the network and how many transactions it can support changes. Perhaps the difficulty algorithm will change. Many other parts of the network may change, and how mining is done may change in many different ways. But let's assume it doesn't change too much. The bottom line, then, is that fees will have to pay miners to continue to mine at the current rate of profitability. If you look, however, at the number of transactions, if we can support more transactions on the blockchain, then the total amount of fees goes up. We saw already in 2017 periods where the amount of income from fees exceeded the block reward. And so therefore, we can see that that's already happening in some cases. Now, because there weren't that many transactions, that means that those transactions were quite expensive. But in the future, the idea is, the assumption is, that by the time fees become the dominant form of reward, because the block reward has dropped very low, then the network will have more capacity, the blocks will have more capacity, and there will be enough transactions with enough small fees to add up to reward miners. Mary asks, how do miners verify that the transactions are valid? Great question. So the way they verify is by running software which follows the exact consensus rules as the rest of the network. So what is a valid transaction? A valid transaction is a transaction that follows all of the rules of consensus written in software that everybody else is following. So you have to kind of guess what the rules of consensus are across the entire network. Now, most of the time, the rules of consensus don't change, or they change very little. And therefore, you don't really have to worry about whether the transactions you're receiving are being validated by the same rules as everybody else. Sometimes, though, when there are changes in the network, like, for example, soft forks or hard forks, during those times, the consensus rules may be changing, and miners have to be very careful to update their software at the right time to the right set of rules to remain in consensus with the rest of the network. But basically, if a miner is running software and that software is the same, uses the same set of rules exactly as the rules that everybody else is using, then it will validate the transactions for them. The software runs through all of these tests to validate a transaction. So we'll look, for example, the amount that's in a transaction. Well, there's a minimum amount. And there's also a maximum amount. There can't be a transaction that's more than 20,999,997 Bitcoin or so. There can't be a transaction that's less than 5,420 or so Satoshis. The date has to be on the block has to be correct. The size of the transaction has to be correct. It can't be more than 520 bytes, if I remember correctly. The script within the transaction has to be correct, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The signatures have to be correct. All of this stuff gets checked by the software. So there's depending on which software you're running, there is some part in that software that takes a transaction that's just been received and runs it through a barrage of tests to make sure that that transaction is valid according to the rules and will remain valid. All right, let's see if there's any follow-up questions in the chat. So most of the questions we get as follow-up questions are slightly out of topic. So I'm going to skip and continue with the questions we have from the forums. Remember, it's better to ask your questions in the forums where other people can also check them and answer them, as well as have this university make sure they're in context for this particular course we're running at the moment. Jean or Jean is asking, in Mastering Bitcoin, page 111, you say, once recorded on the blockchain and confirmed by sufficient subsequent blocks, the transaction is a permanent part of the Bitcoin ledger and is accepted as valid by all participants. The funds allocated to a new owner by the transaction can then be spent. Is this still true? I appear to be able to spend all my recently acquired cryptocurrency immediately on confirmation of receipt, not block confirmation, which appears to be prior to the transaction being recorded in a block. Yes, Jean, you can do that. You're risking the subsequent transaction also being unspendable for a while. Here's why. What you're doing in that particular case is you are spending unconfirmed transaction outputs. You are spending transaction funds that have not yet been confirmed. You are spending an unconfirmed transaction. And what that does is it creates another unconfirmed transaction. And now you have two unconfirmed transactions, only the second one depends on the first. And this is called a chain. In fact, the second transaction is called an orphan. And the chain is the parent and the orphan child. The reason it's an orphan is because it doesn't yet have a confirmed parent. So that chain now of two unconfirmed transactions will sit in the mempool, both transactions, the one you just received that hasn't been confirmed, and the one you just spent that same money again that also hasn't been confirmed. And these two will sit in the mempool waiting. Now, that's not a bad thing, because, in fact, miners use an algorithm where they look at the total value of fees across both of those transactions to decide on whether to include them in the next block. But there is one particular situation where you could have a problem. And that is, if for whatever reason that first transaction that you received doesn't get confirmed, as long as it doesn't get confirmed, the second transaction you made to spend it cannot get confirmed. And so it might just sit out there. So now, if your first transaction is stuck, then your second transaction is stuck also. And if you do this with a lot of transactions, you create a chain of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 transactions, all of which are unconfirmed, all of which depend on each other as a chain. So you receive, and then you spend that money again, and then the output of that you spend in a fourth transaction, and then the output of that you spend in the fifth transaction. Now you've created a chain of 6 transactions, and all of them are unconfirmed. And guess what? The second one can't be confirmed until the first one is confirmed. The third one can't be confirmed until the second one is confirmed. The fourth one can't be confirmed until the third one is confirmed. All of them will just sit there. Now, you might be lucky. They'll all get confirmed in the same block. Perfectly fine, not a problem. And in fact, we see that happening all the time. Imagine an exchange that is creating withdrawal transactions for its users and sending coins out. Well, if it does so, it's going to get some change back. And it has to immediately spend that change to make another withdrawal and get change back and spend that change and get change back and spend that change and get change back and spend that change. It can't wait one block for each of those transactions. No, the exchange is going to create a very long chain, sometimes 1,000 transactions, 500 transactions, 100 transactions, who knows. And they'll all be unconfirmed, and then they'll all get in the same block. But of course, the problem is that you have to constantly make sure that you have sufficient fee. And if you create these chains, the problem of adjusting the fees becomes a bit more complicated. So that's why your wallet is able to spend unconfirmed coins, because it's creating a chain like that. George asks, over 90% of the hash power is located in China with different pools combined. What is stopping them combining forces? OK, first of all, let's look at this question. You state that over 90% of the hash power is located in China by combining different pools. The truth is, we don't know that. That is not an established fact. First of all, pools are not the same as mining power. Pools are collections of miners operating together. And just because a pool might be operated out of China doesn't mean that all the miners participating in that pool are operating out of China. They might be somewhere else, one. Two, We don't know where the pools are, and we don't know where the miners are. We can make guesses, but it's impossible to locate precisely where the miners and the pools are. And this is a feature. This is required in order for Bitcoin to remain decentralized and be able to resist attacks, is that it should be difficult to locate miners. There's a number of ways you can operate a mining pool as well as a mining farm as to hide your location. But in any case, let's say they're all located in China. What is stopping them from combining forces? Very simple. Economic interest is stopping them from combining forces, because combining forces in violation of the consensus rules runs the risk of losing an enormous amount of investment in both the hardware and the electricity that they're spending. And so every 10 minutes, there's an best, and maybe in their economic best interest is to continue mining by the rules. So far, that's exactly what's happened. Miners who have attempted to break the rules have lost enormous amounts of money because they've done so. So combining forces in such a way gives very little advantage in terms of what they can do. You might assume that if you have a 51% attack, you can do whatever you want. It's not true. You can't do whatever you want. And as a result, the advantages of doing a 51% attack are not that high. But the risks of participating in such an attack that fails are enormous. So self-interest keeps miners from combining forces to violate the consensus rules. The second question by George is, would it make more sense to have a rule which doesn't allow a block to be added consecutively from an IP address which originates in the same country? No. And part of the reason is that IP addresses can be faked. There is a very good reason why Bitcoin doesn't use IP addresses to validate who the miners are, because you don't use a consensus algorithm that proves your IP address, proof of IP, because that can be faked. Instead, we use a consensus algorithm that's called proof of work, because proof of work cannot be faked. Faking an IP address and pretending to be from a different place, or having multiple computers that aren't real that you spin up in a virtual system, is called a Sybil attack. And a Sybil attack is when you create lots of fake computers to pretend to have a big vote in a decision, for example. Proof of work specifically solves this. It prevents Sybil attacks. And the way it prevents Sybil attacks is because we don't care what your IP address pretends to be, because IP addresses are not secure identifiers. We care about whether you brought the proof of work, because you can't fake proof of work. Proof of work in itself shows that you have spent the energy. And because we know that energy is not free, that means you have an economic incentive to play by the rules. And that's the only proof that matters. It's very easy to fake an IP address. It's very easy to hide an IP address. It's very easy to reroute an IP address through various forms of VPNs. And so therefore, that's why we don't go by proof of IP, and we go by proof of work. Let's check in the chat room, see how things are going. Anastasis asks, the SHA-256 generates a unique signature. What happens if, despite the low probability, two different text inputs representing private keys produce the same output? Would that give access to someone else's funds? If you could produce the same output from two different private keys, that would give access to someone else's funds. That's called a collision. And well, in fact, you'd have a different problem, which is that both parties would be able to spend from a single address. It would give access to someone else's funds. The thing is, the probability of that happening is so low that it is ridiculous. And that's the basis of security of the elliptic curve public key cryptography, as well as the SHA-256 algorithm. The difficulty of intentionally producing a collision is less than accidentally producing a collision, but is also extremely low. Meaning that if you tried 1 trillion times a second, and then you got 1 trillion of your friends to try 1 trillion times a second, you would still need to do this for millions and millions of years before you could find a key that collided in the SHA-256 space. That would be called brute forcing. And brute forcing a 256-bit number is impossible unless you have a shortcut to the algorithm or a weakness to the algorithm. So theoretically, 2 private keys could produce the same SHA-256. Practically, they won't. And they won't because there are so many combinations that the possibility of that happening is entirely impossible in any practical sense. Anastasis also asks, how is it possible for the majority of mining pools to be operating in China given the recent bans? Will hostile legislation hurt Bitcoin? Well, there's 2 reasons for that. First of all, it is possible that the bans so far that we've heard of in China are not bans in mining. They're bans in using Bitcoin in the banking system. So having exchanges and having bank accounts for exchanges has been made illegal by the central bank in China. But that is not the same as banning mining pools. So first, mining pools, as far as I know, have not been banned in China, and miners have not been banned in China. Could they get banned? Yes, theoretically, laws could be passed to ban mining in China. Now, here's the thing that most people don't realize. We're talking about an enormous country, and we're talking about an enormous country that has a lot of small rural administrations with a lot of mining farms that are distributed across this country. So banning is one thing, like passing the law is one thing. Enforcing the law is quite another. You can imagine that in many cases, a lot of these mining farms represent the single largest economic investment in a very rural area. And that means that everyone from the mayor to the chief of police to the local military general are all receiving very generous tax incentives, let's call them, and other forms of compensation to look the other way. So the law gets passed, and the local official gets on the phone and says, hey, turn it off for a few days, just until they stop paying attention. And then they get another very generous check, and next week you turn it on again. It's not as easy to pass a law like that and actually enforce it. Now, let's say that you had a completely outsized response where not only was mining banned, but the penalties were extremely harsh, and it got to the point where nobody would be willing to take a bribe to allow you to continue to mine. Well, in that case, a lot of the mining power would shut down in China. Not immediately, but over time, the difficulty would adjust down. Other mining operations would immediately become extremely profitable outside of China, which would lead them then to expand very, very rapidly. You might imagine that some of the equipment that was used in China would be sold to miners outside of China, and certainly the manufacture of chips would continue. So again, it's not that easy to simply do that. Gabriel asks, how is computational power and hashing power related? Hashing power is a form of computational power, but a very specific algorithm. So computational power in general is measured in different ways. For example, a common measure for supercomputers is flops, which is floating point operations per second. And flops is useful for engineering. So if you want to do fluid dynamics calculations, for example, you want to do a lot of floating point operations per second. Hashing power is how many hashes you can do per second. And hashing is a different type of computation, which is a very specific algorithm, SHA-256 in the case of Bitcoin. And it's a series of permutation, addition, and substitution operations that happen very, very fast, and they happen in silicon. It's related in terms of the fact that both types of computation have certain properties that are established in physics and information theory, meaning that there is a certain amount of energy required to change one bit from 0 to 1. And you can calculate for any kind of algorithm the minimum amount of energy that will be expended in that particular implementation of the algorithm in order to execute that algorithm. So in terms of pure energy, computation power and hashing power are related. But in most cases, the types of computers that can do very, very fast floating point operations are useless for hashing. And the reason they're useless is because they're not specialized enough. Whereas hashing computers can do one thing only, and they can do it very, very, very fast because that's the only thing they do. So one is a general purpose computer, which is the types of computers that we measure in MIPS, instructions per second, or flops, floating point operations per second. And the other one is a very specialized application-specific integrated circuit, or ASIC, and we measure that in terms of terahashes per second, for example. An even more useful measure for mining equipment is actually joules per terahash, which is how much energy is required in order to produce a terahash, a billion hashes. Sorry, a trillion hashes, not a billion hashes, a trillion hashes. All right. Let's see what other questions we have. A follow-up question to the previous one would supercomputers make SHA-256 collisions more attainable? And the answer is no. Just like would supercomputers be able to mine faster than Bitcoin's mining farms? The answer is no. What if all of the world's supercomputers were put together? The answer is no. What if we built 1,000 times more supercomputers in order to compete with Bitcoin on a national level? The answer, again, is no. And the reason is not because supercomputers are not powerful, but because supercomputers are designed to do general purpose calculations. They're not designed to do just SHA-256. And if you create a chip that only does SHA-256 at 12 nanometers or 10 nanometers of density of fabrication, it will be faster than any general purpose circuit that does other things as well. There will be fewer components on it. You can pack those components as densely as possible and do more SHA-256 calculations per second than any equivalent computer. And not just a few more, orders of magnitude more, multiples of 10 more. George asks, no, sorry. Gabriel asks, is it a rule of Bitcoin or an average number based on computation power that blocks are formed every 10 minutes or so? Both. It is a rule of Bitcoin that the average number of computation forms blocks every 10 minutes. So the rule in Bitcoin is the difficulty of doing the adjusted every 2 weeks so that the average number of blocks in a period of time is equal to a block every 10 minutes. the way this works is, over a period of 2 weeks, there should be 2016 blocks. And therefore, we can count the previous 2 weeks and say, how many blocks were in the past 2 weeks? If the answer is 2016, that means the difficulty of the algorithm and the amount of computation that people are committing to Bitcoin mining is exactly right. It's perfect. Blocks are coming out every 10 minutes, nothing to adjust. Now let's say that we, instead of 2016 blocks, we had 2,217 blocks. So we had effectively 10% more blocks. Well, in that case, the network will make the difficulty 10% higher, exactly the same ratio as the number of blocks we had versus the number of blocks we should have, which is 2016. And if that difference is 10%, then the difficulty algorithm will be adjusted by 10%. And as a result, in future, we'll get closer to 10-minute blocks. If instead of 2016 blocks, we had 1,800 blocks, and we were short by 200 blocks, well, then it's about 10% short. We would adjust by about 10% in the difficulty. That calculation happens every 2016 blocks, every 2 weeks, at exactly the same time, on exactly the same block, and affects the difficulty of the next block across the entire network. Every computer of the network puts in the number of blocks it saw over the last 2 weeks, measures the exact same number, adjusts the difficulty by the exact same amount, and arrives at the exact same answer. And so the entire network switches difficulty for the exact same amount every 2 blocks, every 2 weeks. Jimmy has a great question. Is it possible that the blockchain will not proceed or propagate because we come to a point where the difficulty required cannot be satisfied anymore in all of the iterations of the nonce and extra nonce? Yes, in fact, that has already happened. The reason we have extra nonce is because we got to a point where the difficulty could not be satisfied in the nonce. And so an extra nonce had to be changed. There are a number of other things in the block header that can be changed in order to produce more variation in the block header. The most important one, interestingly enough, is the order of the transactions and the types of transactions you include. So let's say you have 2016 transactions or 2050 transactions in your block. Just pick a number there. And these transactions were received and put into the candidate block in a specific order. Well, because of the order of the transactions in the block, they're going to produce a very specific Merkle tree. So 2,000 transactions, each pair of transactions, the first and second transaction, and then the third and fourth transaction, and then the fifth and sixth transaction are hashed together. And then those hashes are hashed together, and then those hashes are hashed together until you get to the Merkle root up the tree. It's a binary tree. And so if you change 2 transactions at the bottom of the tree, just reverse the order, immediately the calculation all the way up changes, and you get a different Merkle root. So effectively, that's like changing a nonce. You've changed the block header. All you had to do is flip 2 transactions around and recalculate the Merkle root. And with 2,000 transactions in the block, there's a lot of combinations of how you can order those to produce all kinds of variety in the Merkle root. So reordering transactions is one of the ways that miners can vary the header block when they run out of nonce and extra nonce. And in fact, that's already happening. In this particular case, the reason it's happening is because of an advantage called ASIC boost, which is a particular shortcut in the SHA-256 algorithm and the calculation of the mid-state in SHA-256. But the point doesn't really matter. The bottom line is that you can still satisfy the difficulty by varying other parts of the block header. And it's very likely that over the next few years, we're going to see a change in the format of the block header. And one of the things that's going to change in the format of the block header is giving more space for nonce, making a bigger nonce with more bits in it. And there's no reason why that can't be done again. to continue to increase the difficulty. The amount of difficulty that can be calculated with hashes is, and the amount of nonce that's required can be satisfied. That's not a problem. Carl asks, can we mine for altcoins like Ethereum, Litecoin, Dogecoin, and more? Absolutely. Most of the various blockchains out there use a proof-of-work algorithm. There are a small minority that use proof-of-stake, delegated proof-of-stake, and various other algorithms. The vast majority, I just as a ballpark, I would say more than 90% of the cryptocurrencies out there use proof of work in some form or another. And the three most common algorithms for proof of work are the SHA-256 algorithm used in Bitcoin, which is also used in a number of other altcoins, including, for example, Litecoin. The the proof of work SHA algorithm that's used in Bitcoin and used in a number of other blockchains, the script algorithm that's used in Litecoin and a number of other blockchains, ETH-hash or ET-hash, which is the algorithm that's used in Ethereum, which is the Dagger Hashimoto algorithm. And all of these algorithms are different variations on the theme of proof of work. Some of them require more memory than pure computing power, which means they're not as suitable for ASIC mining, which is why they're primarily mined by GPUs, by graphical processing units. So for example, Litecoin's script and Ethereum's ETH-hash are memory hard problems, and therefore they're primarily mined by GPUs, although as the value increases, the motivation to create specialized circuits, ASICs, increases too. It's not impossible to create an ASIC for any algorithm. It's just a matter of how efficient that ASIC is compared to a generic CPU or GPU and what the profit motives are. Eric asks, are 51% attacks more easily carried out when the total number of miners is less than it is now? Yes. If the number of miners decreases, then the number of miners that need to collude in order to launch a 51% attack is obviously less. And the amount of hashing power and energy they're going to put in, if the difficulty decreases, is also less. If there's a drop in the number of miners, for example, after the year 2140, then does a 51% attack become easier? Yes, if there is a drop in the number of miners, then 51% attacks become easier. Let's check very quickly in the chat. Everything's going well. Let's see if we can fit one or two more questions. Ali asks, how are transactions included in the block during the mining process? Is it a case of A, a miner waits to fill up the block with as many transactions before mining it so as to maximize fee, or a miner starts working on proof of work immediately upon receiving a new block, and whatever transactions are in the block when the solution is solved is processed, even though it hasn't reached the maximum number of transactions? Ali, it is B. A miner will immediately start working on proof of work, even if their candidate block at first is empty. And it will be empty because they haven't yet validated the previous block. Now, if they haven't validated the previous block, they don't know what transactions are included in it and whether those transactions are valid. And therefore, they can't put transactions in the candidate block, because if they put a transaction in the candidate block and that transaction is already in the previous block, that's a double spend. And that just made the candidate block invalid. Until they know exactly what is in the previous block and whether everything is valid, any transaction they put in the candidate block could potentially be a double spend, and therefore they cannot include any transaction at first. But they're not going to just turn off the machines. So what almost all miners do, as far as we know, is they immediately start mining an empty block while they validate the previous block that just came in on the network. They validate that block. They validate all of the transactions. They clear the mempool of all of the transactions that are already in that block. And they also check all of the UTXO, the inputs, to make sure they're not double spending anything that was just confirmed. Once they've done all of that validation, now they have a clean mempool. They know that all of the transactions that are remaining unconfirmed in the pool are transactions that could be included in the candidate block. So then they go from mining an empty block to mining a full block immediately, because they just stuff it with every transaction that they can fit with the highest priority to make the maximum amount of fee. So essentially, miners are always mining one of two possibilities. They're either mining an empty block because they just received a block and they haven't validated it yet, so they can't risk putting any transaction in, or they validated the previous block. They now know which transactions they can include. They select as many of them as possible, and they create a new candidate block that is full, which they transmit immediately. Now, which they transmit to the miners to continue mining. So the mining equipment switches from mining an empty block to mining a full block. And that switchover happens very, very quickly, and no time is lost not mining. So the biggest issue here is not to lose time during which you're not mining. You can't stop the equipment. So the equipment is either going to continue mining the old block, which is now worthless, or you're going to have to give it something to mine. And that something is an empty block until you have a better candidate with a lot of transactions. So that completes all of the questions we have time for. Thank you for participating. This is session 2 of the 10th iteration of the Massive Open Online course for the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. This has been Andreas Antonopoulos answering your questions, and I'm looking forward to what we'll have next week. Great questions this week. Remember to ask your questions on the forum, to discuss your questions with your fellow students. Perhaps you can resolve many of these or find other questions that you hadn't even thought of in that discussion. And then I'll take all of your questions. See you next week around the same time for session 3 of the MOOC. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.